The Tirai fleet arrived in Earth's orbit with a grandeur that defied comprehension. Their massive ships, shaped like predatory cephalopods, loomed against the planet's blue and green tapestry, their exteriors shimmering with an oily iridescence. From the ground, the sky seemed to fracture under their weight, the once bright sun now dimmed by their overwhelming presence. People stared upward, transfixed and terrified. When the first broadcast came, it was a voice that resonated like metal scraping stone, speaking in flawless English. Humans of Earth, you are hereby subjugated by the will of the Tirai Dominion. Surrender and you will be permitted to serve. Resist and you will be eradicated. The message repeated on every frequency in every language, accompanied by an image of a Tirai overlord, towering, spindly limbed, with a head that was all eyes and jagged mandibles. It wasn't the image of conquerors Earth had prepared for. It was worse. Far from the chaos of the cities, Anders Grayson stood on the deck of a decommissioned orbital defense station, his boots planted as though anchoring him to the spinning void. A thin, translucent panel hovered before him, displaying the frantic chatter from Earth's Defense Council. On one half of the screen, political leaders barked over each other, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. On the other, fragmented images of Earth's military scrambled to respond, their readiness splintered by years of complacency and weapons pointed inwards at one another rather than toward the stars. "We need you in command, Anders." General Takara's voice cut through the noise. Her face, marked with the deep lines of too many hard decisions, was the only one he focused on. "You know these systems better than anyone." Anders' jaw clenched. The faint hum of the station's generators vibrated through his boots, the only sound in the empty command room besides Takara's plea. "I was decommissioned for a reason," Anders said flatly. "I'm not your savior." "You're what we have," Takara shot back. "Or are you going to let Earth burn because of a grudge?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted to the viewport. Through it, he could see the edge of the Tirai fleet's vanguard. They moved with the slow, deliberate menace of predators who knew there was no escape for their prey. The council's voices rose in a cacophony, but Anders had already made up his mind. Patch me through to Fleet Command," he sighed, "and clear the civilians off this channel." The Tirai struck within hours. Their initial assault was surgical, dismantling Earth's orbital defenses with a precision that bordered on art. Plasma beams carved through satellites and orbital platforms like knives through silk. The debris rained down in fiery streaks, illuminating the night skies with Earth's first losses. Anders had taken command of the Earth's remaining fleet, a ragtag assembly of outdated frigates, hastily retrofitted cargo haulers, and a handful of experimental ships that had never seen real combat. He stood at the center of the command deck aboard the Resolute, a cruiser as battered as its new captain. "Status report," Anders barked, his voice cutting through the tension. Around him, the crew moved with barely contained panic, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. "Enemy fleet maintaining formation," Lieutenant Kessler reported, her fingers flying across her console. "They're moving into the upper atmosphere." "And our assets?" "Minimal," she admitted. "But we've got the Archon sphere online. It's ready for deployment." The mention of the Archon sphere drew a pause from the room. It wasn't a weapon anyone spoke of lightly. Developed in secret during the last days of Earth's military buildup, it was a technological marvel, capable of harnessing energy on a scale that bordered on apocalyptic. Anders had seen the test footage. A single pulse had reduced one of the barren moons around Jupiter to a fine mist, only luckily avoiding destabilizing the orbits of its others. But deploying it now meant risking everything. "Hold it in reserve," Anders ordered. "We'll use it if we have no other choice." Far above, aboard the Tirai command ship, Vakresh, Dax Grayson, adjusted his stance as two Tirai guards shoved him into a dimly lit engineering bay. The air was thick with the tang of ionized metal, and the walls pulsed faintly with energy conduits. It had been weeks since he was captured preceding the invasion, and he had learned to keep his defiance buried beneath a veneer of compliance. "Human," Kavar's voice grated from the shadows. The Tirai overseer stepped forward, his chitinous armor clinking with each deliberate movement. "Your species is quaint, but your mind is sharp. You will serve us well." Dax resisted the urge to spit at his captor's feet. Instead, he focused on the task before him, recalibrating one of the Tirai's plasma relays. His hands moved deftly, guided by a mix of instinct and necessity. As he worked, his mind raced with calculations of another kind. Over the past days, Dax had discovered that the Tirai's systems, while advanced, were not infallible. Small errors, introduced subtly, could cascade into larger malfunctions. He'd already begun testing the limits of his interference, creating glitches that the Tirai attributed to routine maintenance issues. Tonight, he planned to go farther. "Your silence is acceptable," Kavar said, his mandibles clicking with what Dax assumed was amusement. "But do not mistake my patience for leniency. Failure will be punished." Dax nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving the relay. As Kavar turned to leave, Dax's fingers brushed against a concealed compartment on the relay's housing. He slid a small tool inside, leaving a microfracture in the power conduit. The sabotage was imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Dax knew its potential. On the Resolute, Anders monitored the Tirai fleet's movements. Their vanguard had slowed, their formation loosening ever so slightly. "Kessler, what's causing that disruption?"
"Unknown," she said, frowning at her console. "But it's giving us a window."
Anders didn't hesitate. "Bring us about. Target their lead ships with the rail cannons. All ships focus fire. This is our chance to hit back." The fleet moved as one, a coordinated strike that defied their patchwork composition. Experimental U.S. rail slugs tore through the vacuum, slamming into the Tirai's hulls. Explosions made by Chinese missiles lit up the dark void, the first tangible victory of the battle. On the ground, people watched the fiery streaks in the sky and felt the first flicker of hope. The Tirai regrouped quickly, their counterattack fierce. Plasma beams lanced through Earth's fleet, and the Resolute shook violently as a blast glanced off the thin electromagnetic barrier emitted just inches above the surface of its hull, the first and only energy shield humanity had ever made.
"Shields at 30%,
Kessler shouted. Anders gripped the console. "Divert all power to forward shields. Keep firing. We're not done yet."
"Sir, the Archon sphere..."
He closed his eyes briefly, weighing the cost. "Prepare it for deployment. Target the center of their fleet and tell the rest of the ships to fall back." The room went silent as the command sank in. Moments later, a low hum began to build, growing into a resonant thrum that vibrated through the ship's hull. The Archon sphere fired. A blinding wave of energy erupted from the Resolute, consuming the Tirai's central formation in an instant. When the light faded, only debris remained, spinning listlessly in the void. The fleet had been dealt a crippling blow, but the cost of such power was etched into every face aboard the Resolute, as well as the hulls of the entire haphazard fleet. The Resolute was somewhat shielded, but everyone else was nearly fried by the flash. Anders stared out at the wreckage, his expression unreadable. "And this is only the beginning," he said quietly. The Vakresh shuddered as an explosion rippled through its lower decks, the impact rocking even the heavily armored command chamber. Overseer Kavar's mandibles clicked in irritation as he braced himself against a glowing control panel. Around him, Tirai technicians scrambled, their movements frantic yet precise, their chitinous limbs moving with alien efficiency. "Report!" Kavar bellowed, his voice reverberating through the chamber. A junior officer, its smaller, lighter frame marking it as an engineer caste, chittered nervously.
"A power fluctuation in the plasma conduits. It caused a chain reaction. Containment fields are holding, but only just. Sir, our advanced formation was obliterated. Some kind of massive energy pulse."
Kavar's multifaceted eyes narrowed. He'd been cautious since taking Dax Grayson aboard, monitoring the human closely. Yet no matter how often the human's tools and hands were searched, the results were always the same. Nothing. Kavar loathed to admit it, but there was something unnervingly resourceful about this particular human. "Double the guard at engineering," he growled, "and ensure the human's work is supervised." The junior officer hesitated for a moment too long. Kavar's hand shot out, claws grazing the smaller Tirai's thorax in a warning. "Do not test me," Kavar hissed. "Go!" As the officer scurried away, Kavar turned to the primary viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, the remnants of Earth's orbital defenses were still visible, burning against the planet's atmosphere. Yet despite their losses, the humans' resistance had already cost the Dominion more than anticipated, a fact that burned Kavar's pride like acid. Dax wiped sweat from his brow as he crouched in the tight confines of the Vakresh's secondary engineering hub. The sabotage had gone as planned, though the narrow escape from the ensuing chaos had left his pulse hammering. He glanced at the makeshift toolkit he'd assembled, pieces scavenged from Tirai machinery, concealed in compartments and folds of his uniform. It was rudimentary, but effective. The real prize, however, lay before him, a data port embedded in the bulkhead. Dax had learned the Tirai's systems were decentralized but interconnected, their data pathways crisscrossing the ship like veins. Plugging in his spliced interface, he began downloading schematics and operational logs. He needed something, anything, to give Anders and the Earth fleet an edge. "Come on," he muttered under his breath as the download crawled forward. His fingers twitched with impatience. Footsteps. Heavy. Rhythmic. Dax froze. The distinctive clack of Tirai claws on metal decking echoed closer. He quickly disconnected the interface, slipping it into his sleeve, and turned to his work panel, feigning concentration. 2 guards entered the room, their imposing forms silhouetted against the harsh overhead lighting. "Human," one of them hissed, mandibles clicking ominously. "You will relocate to primary engineering. Overseer's orders." Dax forced a neutral expression. "Understood." As they escorted him away, he mentally cataloged the new data. Time was running out, but if he could smuggle this information to Anders, Earth might still have a fighting chance. Aboard the Resolute, Anders studied the fleet's tactical display with grim intensity. The holographic map showed the Tirai forces regrouping, the remaining ships forming a dense, layered phalanx around their command vessels. Earth's fleet, what little remained, hovered on the outskirts, battered but intact. "They're adapting," Lieutenant Kessler said, breaking the tense silence. She gestured to the display. "That formation is perfect for nullifying long-range firepower, which is basically all our vessels have. They're forcing us into close combat." "Which is exactly where they have the advantage," Anders muttered. "Sir," another officer interjected, "we've intercepted faint transmissions. It's Dax, your brother, the engineer that vanished a couple weeks ago. He's alive." Anders' head snapped up. "Patch it through." A burst of static filled the room before Dax's voice broke through, faint but clear. "Anders, got intel. Critical. Sending coordinates and data packets. Tirai, vulnerable. Power relays, choke point." The transmission cut off abruptly, but not before a set of coordinates flashed across the display. Anders' heart clenched. His brother was alive, but for how long? "Kessler, analyze those coordinates," Anders ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. "Find me that choke point." Dax's situation had grown more precarious. The guard's constant presence left him little room for maneuvering, and Kavar's scrutiny was becoming unbearable. The Overseer's multifaceted eyes seemed to watch him even when he wasn't there. But Dax had learned to adapt. Over the years, he'd honed his instincts to razor sharpness, the kind that landed him a job as the chief engineer aboard his brother's own experimental vessel. One needed an intuition bordering on predilection to safety manage unstable experimental technology. When the opportunity presented itself, he took it, even if it was only a fleeting moment. That moment came during a routine systems check. While the guards were momentarily distracted, Dax accessed a secondary console and transmitted a burst of encrypted data. He didn't know if it had reached the Resolute, but it was the best he could do. For now. "We have the data," Kessler announced, her tone triumphant. "Dax identified a critical weakness in their power distribution network. If we hit it here," she pointed to a highlighted node on the map, "we could destabilize their entire formation." "But to do that," Anders said, "we need to get close. Very close." The room fell silent. The TRI's close quarters superiority was well known, and any attempt to breach their formation would come at a steep cost. "Prepare the fleet," Anders said finally. "We'll punch through their defenses and hit that node, no matter what it takes." The battle that followed was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Earth's fleet surged forward, a desperate wave against the TRI's calculated defense. The Resolute led the charge, its rail cannons firing relentlessly as smaller ships flanked its sides, their maneuverability offsetting their lack of firepower. Anders stood at the center of the command deck, barking orders with a calm that defied the chaos around him. Every impact against the ship's hull sent shudders through the deck, but he remained steady, his focus unyielding. "Target the relay," he ordered. "All weapons, fire." The combined barrage of Earth's fleet struck the TRI node in a dazzling explosion. The enemy formation faltered, their ships thrown into disarray, as power surges rippled through their network. "They're breaking," Kessler said, her voice filled with awe, but Anders knew better than to celebrate. "Regroup the fleet," he commanded. "Prepare for their counterattack." On the Vakresh, Kavar seethed. The human's interference was no longer an annoyance. It was a threat. He stormed into the engineering bay, his claws clicking with barely restrained fury. "You!" he snarled, pointing a claw at Dax. "You've outlived your usefulness." Dax met the Overseer's gaze with defiance. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing about you." Before Kavar could react, a concealed device in Dax's hand detonated. It wasn't a weapon, but an EMP pulse, strong enough to disable all electronics in the immediate area. As the TRI guards collapsed, their powered armor systems overloaded, Dax bolted, weaving through the chaos he'd unleashed. His path led him to an escape pod bay. With the ship still reeling from the Resolute's strike, he managed to override the launch controls and strap himself in. As the pod ejected, he caught a final glimpse of the Vakresh through the viewport, its once imposing form now riddled with the scars of battle. Dax took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. On the Resolute, Anders received the signal. Dax's escape pod had been detected, and recovery teams were already en route. "We've got him," Kessler said, a rare smile breaking through her professional demeanor. Anders allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but as he turned back to the tactical display, his expression hardened. The battle was far from over. The Vakresh burned in the distance, its once majestic bulk now a shattered silhouette against the stars. Dax Grayson sat in the cramped confines of the escape pod, his pulse finally beginning to slow. Outside the viewport, the scattered remains of the TRI fleet drifted in chaos. Despite the victory, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The pod's comm crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. "Dax, this is the Resolute. We have visual on your pod. Sit tight. Recovery is inbound." Relief washed over him at the sound of Anders' voice. "Copy that. Took you long enough," he replied, his tone wry despite the fatigue. Minutes later, the escape pod shuddered as the retrieval arm locked onto its hull. A brief jolt followed, and Dax was hauled aboard the Resolute. The pod hatched open with a hiss, revealing Anders and a recovery team. Anders stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief and restrained anger. "You look like hell," Anders said, offering a hand. Dax smirked weakly as he took it. "Nice to see you too, big brother." Back on the bridge, Anders and Dax stood side by side, reviewing the tactical map. The TRI fleet was in disarray, but their command vessels were regrouping, a testament to their discipline and resilience. We've bought ourselves time, Anders said, his tone grim. But they'll be back, and they'll be angrier than ever. Then we hit them first, Dax replied. He tapped a highlighted section of the map. They're using Io as a logistical hub. Without it, their fleet loses coordination and supply lines. We take it out, and they're done. That's deep in Tirai-controlled space, Lieutenant Kessler interjected. We don't have the resources for an offensive like that. We're barely holding on to the inner three as it is. Dax turned to her, his expression resolute. We can't wait for them to recover. If we're going to survive, we need to take risks. Anders studied the map in silence, his jaw tight. Finally, he nodded. Prepare the fleet. We're moving out. The journey to the Tirai hub was fraught with tension. The fleet's engineers worked tirelessly to repair the damage from the last engagement, while the crew prepared for the inevitable battle ahead. Morale was mixed, hope tempered by the reality of their situation. Dax spent much of his time in the lower decks, working with the technicians to adapt the stolen Tirai schematics. The alien systems were complex, but Dax's unconventional methods and quick thinking made him an invaluable asset. You're not like most officers, one of the engineers remarked as Dax bypassed a stubborn circuit. No offense, sir, but you're different. Dax chuckled. None taken. Let's just say I've always preferred breaking things to fixing them. The engineer grinned. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. As the fleet approached the Tirai hub, the tension on the Resolute reached a breaking point. Anders stood at the helm, his voice calm and steady as he issued orders. Remember the plan, he said, addressing the assembled officers. We hit their defenses hard and fast, then target the hub's core systems. If we succeed, we cripple their fleet. If we fail... He let the sentence hang, the unspoken consequences clear. We won't fail, Dax said, his voice cutting through the tension. We've come too far for that. Anders met his brother's gaze and nodded. Let's make it count. The attack began with a coordinated strike. Earth's fleet emerged from the warp, a newly developed technology based on the Tirai schematic Dax stole. The enemy's response was swift and brutal, their ships surging forward in a deadly counteroffensive. On the bridge of the Resolute, the chaos was palpable. Officers shouted orders, alarms blared, and the ship shook under the impact of enemy fire. Anders remained calm, his focus unshakable. Target their command vessels, he ordered. Draw their attention away from the strike teams. Dax, meanwhile, led one of those strike teams. Earth didn't have the resources to be picky, and Dax's knowledge of the reverse-engineered alien tech gave him an edge other pilots didn't have. Piloting a small, agile craft, he and his squadron weaved through the enemy lines, evading fire as they closed in on the hub. The Tirai defenses were formidable, but Dax's unorthodox tactics kept them one step ahead. Hold steady, he said over the comm. We're almost there. The hub loomed ahead, a massive structure bristling with weapons and shielding covering Io in a shell of metal. A giant forge, using the moon's natural volcanism as a power source. Dax initiated a complex maneuver, guiding his craft through a narrow gap in the defenses. His squadron followed, their ships moving in perfect synchronization. Inside the hub, chaos reigned. Dax's team deployed after landing in one of the hangars, fighting their way through the corridors as they planted charges on critical systems. The Tirai fought back fiercely, their alien forms moving with terrifying speed and precision. But the humans' determination and ingenuity proved their equal. Charges are set, Dax reported. Get out. The team retreated to their ships, narrowly escaping as the charges detonated. The explosion tore through the hub, its careful orbital balance now collapsing and crashing upon Io's surface. On the Resolute, cheers erupted as the tactical display showed the enemy fleet breaking apart. Suddenly in dire straits, without a sure source of fuel and munitions they must now find ways to conserve. Anders allowed himself a rare smile, but it was tinged with sadness. The cost of victory had been high, and many of their ships would not return. We did it, Kessler said, her voice filled with awe. Anders nodded. For now. But the war isn't over. The Resolute drifted into orbit over Io, as if to gloat over the shattered remains of the Tirai hub. For once, the stars around them were silent, the chaos of battle replaced by an eerie stillness. On the bridge, Anders Grayson surveyed the tactical display, his face a mask of grim determination. The fleet had endured, but just barely. They'd won a battle, not the war. "Damage report," Anders ordered, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bridge. Lieutenant Kessler leaned over her console.
Multiple hull breaches across the fleet. Engineering crews are working on containment. Casualty reports are still coming in. It's bad, sir.
Anders nodded sharply. He'd expected no less. Prioritize the worst off. Get the med bays running at full capacity. Dax entered the bridge, his flight suit still scorched from the mission. He looked around at battered crew, his eyes meeting Anders'. The shared look conveyed everything they couldn't say aloud. The cost, the toll, and the unyielding resolve to finish what they'd started. "We need to keep moving," Dax said, stepping beside his brother. "The Tirai will regroup. If we're still here when they do, we're dead." Anders glanced at the tactical display. "Agreed. Plot a course back to Earth. We need repairs and reinforcements. Let's hope that the new warp tech works in reverse." As the fleet limped away from the wreckage, the atmosphere aboard the Resolute was a mix of exhaustion and fragile hope. In the ship's mess hall, Dax sat with a handful of crew members, their faces lined with fatigue. The tension in the air was palpable, broken only by the occasional clatter of utensils. "Never thought I'd see the Tirai run," one of the engineers muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They seemed invincible, what with their energy shields and laser beams, decades ahead of anything we've got." "They're not invincible," Dax replied, his tone firm. "They just want us to think they are. We proved them wrong today." The engineer nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Here's to proving them wrong again." Dax raised his mug in a silent toast, the gesture mirrored by others around the table. Hours later, Anders and Dax met in the ship's war room. The holographic map displayed their current position. With the hub around Io gone, the Tirai fleet scattered back to their nearest star systems, and humanity, now in possession of warp technology. It took less than a day to reclaim most of the space around Sol. But the Tirai Empire consisted of hundreds of star systems. "We need a plan," Anders said, his voice low. "Something big enough to turn the tide." Dax studied the map, his brow furrowed in thought. "Their empire is built on fear. When I accessed remote records while they had me enslaved on their ship, I saw a history of how many species they'd conquered," he said slowly. "We take out their figurehead, whoever's calling the shots, and the whole thing collapses. The other client races will rebel." "Easier said than done," Anders replied. "Their leadership will be hidden behind layers of defenses. We need a Trojan horse," Dax interrupted, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Something they can't ignore, something they'll bring straight to their doorstep." Anders looked at his brother, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You have something in mind?" Dax grinned. "Let's just say I've got a few ideas." The next phase of their plan began to take shape. Using the stolen Tirai schematics, Dax and his team designed a decoy, a ship rigged to look like Vakresh's command vessel and loaded with enough explosives to rival a small star. The goal was simple: infiltrate the heart of the Tirai Empire and strike a blow so devastating it would shatter their morale. "This is suicide," Lieutenant Kessler said as she reviewed the plans. "There's no way you'll make it out alive." Dax shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time someone said that. Kessler's jaw tightened. "It's a gamble." "It's the only chance we've got," Dax replied. "Unless you've got a better idea." When no one spoke, Dax turned to Anders. "What do you think?" Anders studied the schematics, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "We do it. But we do it smart. We're not throwing lives away unless we've got a real shot at pulling this off." The mission was set in motion. Dax took command of the decoy ship, its crew hand-picked for their skill and loyalty. As the fleet prepared to deploy, Anders and Dax stood together on the bridge of the Resolute. "You sure about this?" Anders asked, his voice low. Dax smirked. "Since when have you known me to back down?" Anders sighed, clapping a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Just come back in one piece, all right?" "No promises," Dax replied with a grin. The decoy ship departed, displaying a transponder signal mimicking the IFF of the original command ship. AI generation technology had made it easy to make a believable recording of Vakresh's voice asking for help, asking for an audience with the Emperor to inform him of a matter of utmost urgency. "Approaching the target," the pilot reported, her voice steady despite the stakes. Dax nodded. "Hold position. Let them come to us." Minutes later, the ship's sensors picked up a massive Tirai fleet closing in. The decoy had worked. A massive fleet surrounded them, including a gargantuan capital vessel the size of a small moon itself. A communication screen opened, displaying the face of the Emperor that Dax saw in the records of the Empire he'd accessed.
"I considered Vakresh like a son, pathetic worms. You cannot fool me with your artificial tricks. I'm sure you thought we'd gladly deliver you to our homeworld. No. Instead, I am here to wreak vengeance personally. Your one vessel would do nothing before the might of my armada."
"This is for Earth," he said quietly, patently ignoring the alien tyrant's words. Then pressed the button. The explosion was blinding. The explosives Dax loaded onto the ship were in fact the sum total of Earth's entire nuclear arsenal, all of them rigged for simultaneous detonation and contained within an experimental shield based on one recovered from the wreckage of Vakresh's original command vessel, alongside a grotesque amount of volatile nuclear materials not originally meant for ordnance. A Tsar Bomba, times tens of thousands. It took days to convince the various nations that it was worth it for the sake of humanity. It was a supernova. By the time a pre-placed satellite's long-distance telescope could see again, it was nothing but blank, empty space. Back aboard the Resolute, the crew mourned the loss of Dax, the man who saved humanity, and the crew of men and women that joined him in martyrdom. Their sacrifice was etched into the fabric of humanity's fight for survival, and would go down as the single greatest act of heroism in human history. Anders stood alone in his quarters, staring out at the stars. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, victory felt within reach. With their capital ship destroyed and Emperor dead, it would only be a matter of time before worlds all over the Tirai Empire began to join humanity in rebellion. "You did it, Dax," Anders said softly. "We'll finish this. For you."